Good morning. We're going to pick up where we left off last week in Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 through 57, the end of the chapter. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the earth. This is the word of the Lord. Redemption is a fascinating concept when you think about it, and we actually see this theme of redemption in so many different places, just in our lives and in the things that we enjoy. One of the places it's most noticeable, at least in my opinion, is in film and literature. We hear about these redemptive arcs that occur in the story or in the life of a particular character. Some of the greatest examples, in my opinion, are Ebenezer Scrooge and the Grinch, both of whom have these incredible redeeming arcs in their stories. Now, the interesting thing about redemption stories is that we as people absolutely love them. This is why you watch Hallmark at Christmas. You love the redemptive stories that are being told. We flock to them. And the reason that I believe this is the case, that we love this idea of redemption in film and literature so much, is specifically because we recognize deep within ourselves, all of humanity, not just Christians, our desperate need to be redeemed. That need for redemption was baked into who we are at the fall, and it remains there, and that's why we're so attracted to these stories of redemption. So this morning, we're going to consider this theme of redemption in Genesis chapter 41, the second half of it, and we're going to see, at least I hope we will see, how Joseph was redeemed from the pit, how he was redeemed from his past, and how he was redeemed for a purpose. Now, Seth can alliterate really well. That took me hours. Redeemed from the pit, redeemed from his past, and redeemed for a purpose. Last week, we left Joseph in the presence of Pharaoh, if you remember. Pharaoh and his advisors If you'll remember, Pharaoh had had two dreams, and Joseph was called up out of prison to give the interpretation for these two dreams, which he does, and then he follows that up with an unsolicited proposal to Pharaoh about how he should order his kingdom in light of these dreams. But at that point in the story, as we're beginning where we are this morning, Joseph has not actually been freed from prison. He's only been brought before Pharaoh for the purpose of interpreting these dreams to see if he can. And so at this point, nothing has actually even been said that even suggests the possibility that Joseph would be freed, much less made second in command. Pharaoh didn't make any promises, good or bad, in our previous text regarding Joseph when he was brought before him. So let's take a closer look then at what this text tells us. Pharaoh and his servants, it starts off saying, were pleased by Joseph's proposal. This is the unsolicited proposal that Joseph gave after his interpretation. And so Pharaoh asks his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Now, the answer to that question, if you're standing in front of Pharaoh as his servants, is no, duh. They just looked over all of Egypt to find somebody who could interpret dreams and could not find anyone. So why is Pharaoh even asking this question? But he does, right? Genesis 41:8, we read, so in the morning, Pharaoh's spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all his wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So of course there's not anybody in the land who can interpret the dreams. We already know this. Pharaoh makes this statement, and then asks this question to his advisors, and then he says to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. Now, how does Pharaoh know that God showed Joseph the meaning of his dreams? Pharaoh's a polytheistic ruler, believed in many gods. Well, the answer, again, comes in a previous text, back in 41:16. That's exactly what Joseph told Pharaoh when he was called up. Pharaoh said, can you interpret these dreams? And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me, God will give. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Joseph points out that the answer would come from God. And what we have here is Pharaoh simply repeating what he had heard from Joseph earlier. Now, Pharaoh responds to these interpretations, and he responds to Joseph's proposal by elevating Joseph to second in command. And some of the commentators say this is actually sort of a vizier position, that there may have been other rulers under Pharaoh similar to Joseph, but this idea of being put second in command elevates him to some extent above these other men. That's evident by the fact that he's made to ride in Pharaoh's second chariot. But he says to Joseph, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. Now, I got distracted this week on this statement, and all my people shall order themselves as you command, and you'll see why in just a second. This is an idiomatic phrase, an idiomatic expression that probably describes all of Egypt paying homage to Joseph. But I got distracted because that's not what the Hebrew actually says. And I just found this nugget that I feel compelled to share with you. If you were to read this literally, Pharaoh said to Joseph, all my people will kiss you on the mouth. It's just what it says, right? The idea here is paying homage. Literally that they would respect him, maybe kiss his ring, bow down before him and kiss the ground. There are a lot of ways to kind of interpret it. But it is this idea of Pharaoh saying, all my people will give you homage as second in command of my people. Now, elevating Joseph in this way might seem a little bit drastic, might seem a little bit strange to us as we read it in our modern era. I mean, you take a guy out of prison, he interprets a couple of dreams for you. Conveniently, the interpretation of those dreams isn't going to be fulfilled for 7 years, so he's bought himself some time. So what do you do with him? Well, let's put him second in command. He seems like a trustworthy guy. Seems a little premature from my point of view. Kind of like that fella who says, I love you on the first date. I didn't, but I was close. But it's really not. It's really not premature. It's not out of place. Joseph has done here what nobody else could do. Joseph interpreted both of these dreams for Pharaoh, and in addition to having interpreted these dreams from Pharaoh, Joseph has a proven track record. Potiphar could have given testimony to who he was, and the jailer, assuming it wasn't Potiphar, could have given testimony about Joseph's character. So he already has a proven track record. And he's put in this place, this prominent place of authority, and his name is changed to an Egyptian name, and then he's given an Egyptian wife. And we see that Joseph here has been redeemed from prison. He's been redeemed from prison. He's now the second most powerful man in Egypt, probably one of the most powerful men in all of the region at the time. But his arc of redemption is only beginning. His arc of redemption, in fact, runs sort of from this point all the way through the rest of the book of Genesis. And this rise to power is actually consistent with what the narrative has already told us about the nature of Joseph in regards to his relationships in Egypt. We know that God is with him. We know that God blesses everything he does. We saw that in 39, verses 2 and 3. So after Potiphar sees this reality in Joseph, what does he do? He puts him in charge of his entire household. Later on, the jailer in 39, 22, and 23 also sees that God is blessing Joseph and places him over all of the prisoners. So now Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and the same pattern repeats itself a third time. God blesses Joseph, and Pharaoh raises him up to second in command. Now, on each of these occasions, when you look at sort of the interaction between Joseph and whoever is lifting him up, you see that Joseph does something he sort of proves himself in some way. Whether it's the body of work or something else, there's some sort of proving that happens that results in this. And this happens as well with Pharaoh, but this time it's his unique ability to interpret the dreams that is sort of the body of work that ends up getting him lifted up to be second in command. And this appreciation of Joseph among the Egyptians, and he is appreciated among the Egyptians as we read, stands in stark contrast to the way his family, especially his brothers, felt about him. If you remember, they hated him. They got rid of him. And so you have sort of this strange reversal where the Egyptians love Joseph, and his family hates him, when you would have expected the opposite, which is just sort of an interesting reality about the story, and it keeps our attention. There's more to Joseph's redemption than being redeemed from prison. He is, in a much larger sense, redeemed from what we can call the pit. And the pit is, being redeemed from the pit is a way to refer to prison. That's exactly what 41:14 calls prison, is the pit. But it's bigger than that. Joseph's redemption from the pit is a redemption from all the evil that has befallen him to this point in his life. In fact, the trajectory of Joseph's life in the text to this point, at least from a literary standpoint, has been consistently downward. We hear or read that he was thrown down into the pit by his brothers, that he was carried down to Egypt by the Midianites, that he went down to prison in Egypt. And so in some senses, we might even say that Joseph has been in the pit ever since his brothers literally tossed him into a pit so many years prior. But Joseph's downward trajectory in the text is mirrored by his rise to power, in that on 3 occasions he was lifted up as well. We see that he was lifted up over Potiphar's house, that he was lifted up over the prison, and that now he is being lifted up over all of Egypt. So Joseph's redemption from the pit is both figurative and also literal. But not only was Joseph redeemed from the pit, we also see that he was redeemed from his past. As we move forward into verse 46, we see that Joseph was 30 years old when these events take place, when he enters the service of Pharaoh. If we look back to the beginning of what we call the Joseph narrative, or this Joseph cycle, which begins in chapter 37, you'll remember that he was 17 when all of this began. He was 17. So he's 30, that's a total of 13 years that have passed, and I want you to just stop. Just stop and think about that. 17-year-old boy being carried away to a foreign land for 13 years. We have a hard time divorcing ourselves from our reality with the constant communication and contact. I mean, people are always available. Joseph could not get in touch with his family. He did not hear from them. He did not see them. He did not know anything about them for 13 years now. It's as if they were dead to him. What must that have been like for this young man as he begins to live out his new life in Egypt? And these verses then tell us that for 7 years, Joseph implemented, and he faithfully implemented, the plan that God had given him for the good of Egypt. There were 7 years of plenty, and Joseph goes throughout all the land of Egypt, and he collects 20% of the grain that was produced, and he stores it in storehouses in every city all over Egypt. And there are a couple of very insightful comments in the text that I think are worth at least briefly exploring here. The first is in verse 47, which says, during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. Now, that's an interesting comment, at least in my opinion, because I find in this statement a reminder that the bountiful production of the earth was, in fact, according to God's plan and according to his purposes and according to his design. This was not just an accidental, Joseph happened to line up with the 7 years of prosperity from an agricultural standpoint. God made the earth produce especially for this occasion. God's working at something here that is much bigger than Joseph and Pharaoh and Egypt. The second comes in the latter portion of verse 49, where we read that Joseph stored up grain in great abundance. And the text says, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Like the sand of the sea. That phrase only occurs in 4 places in the Old Testament, and this is one of them. 2 of the others are Isaiah 10:22 and Hosea 1:10, and both of them refer to Israel as a people. Isaiah 10:22 says, for though your people Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. And then Hosea 1:10 says, yet the number of children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. All 3 of these texts, in my opinion, come from the 4th text. The 4th text is the source text for these, and it's Genesis 32:12. Now, these are the words of Jacob back to God, referring to the promise that God had given Abraham many years prior. And God's promise to Abraham is worded a little bit differently, but this is what Jacob says in Genesis 32:13. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So Moses here, as he writes this, is drawing intentional connections between Joseph and the patriarchs. In the remaining verses in this section, the story shifts, and we see that Joseph becomes a father. He becomes a father, and God gives him 2 boys. He names them Manasseh and Ephraim. And there are a couple of things that I want you to notice here. First, that are just interesting. First, Joseph's boys are given Hebrew names. They're not given Egyptian names. And part of the way we know that is because they give us a meaning for their names. Joseph's name, when he was given an Egyptian name, was not, no meaning was associated with it. But here we do have meaning. And second, probably more importantly, is that the names of Joseph's boys tell us that he's been redeemed from his past. What do I mean by that? Joseph has suffered tremendously. I mean, by this point in the narrative, he's been apart from his family, not for 13 years, but for 20. Now, I have no doubt that Joseph wrestled during those 20 years with the reality of the circumstances of his life as he was wronged over and over again and as he suffered in prison, as he wrestled with the knowledge that he would probably never see his family again. And the first thing that Joseph says when he names his son is that God freed him from all his hardship and from his family. That is, in my opinion, he has come to terms with his circumstances. He doesn't appear to be angry with God, and he doesn't appear to be angry with his brothers or his family in general. Now, I believe that this is the moment in Joseph's story, or maybe slightly before this, that God has done such a work in his heart that he is now able, so many years later, when his brothers come to Egypt to buy food, and I'm going to ruin the end of the story, he helps them, but he makes this incredible statement to his brothers in Genesis 50, 20 to 21. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. Joseph's brothers were scared that he was going to kill him after Jacob died. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Those words on the lips of Joseph so many years later, I believe, were born out of his experience of redemption from God here. Not only has God freed him from his hardship, not only has God freed him from his family and his past, but he has blessed him and made him fruitful in Egypt. So Joseph has been redeemed from his past, but beyond that, God has blessed him and made him fruitful in Egypt. The partial fulfillment of God's promises in Joseph also connects him to the larger narrative of the patriarchs before him. And we're going to talk about that connection in just a minute, so I just want you to hang on to that idea for right now. But Joseph was redeemed from the pit, he was redeemed from his past, and now we will see that he was redeemed for a purpose. The famine finally arrives, is what we read in the text. Just as Joseph said it would, it's not limited in scope to Egypt. This is a massive famine. In fact, they say it was of historic proportions because it was rare that both the Nile and Canaan suffered famine at the same time. This is a massive deal and affects the surrounding nations as well, but there is bread in Egypt. There's bread in Egypt because of God's provision through Joseph. So once the famine hits and the people begin to get hungry, Pharaoh directs them back to Joseph, who then begins to implement the second half of his plan by dispersing food. And he opens the storehouses and he sells the food to the Egyptians, and there's going to be more details about how this plan works in coming chapters, but we'll just leave it there for now. It wasn't just the Egyptians, though. The text says all the earth came to buy grain because the famine was severe everywhere. Now that statement, all the earth, isn't literal. It doesn't mean that everybody in the whole world came to Joseph to buy grain. It just means that everybody, or many people from that region, came to Egypt to buy grain. And this actually sets us up as readers for the next chapter when Joseph's brothers themselves will come to Egypt to buy grain and food as well. But now I want to go back to that idea of being connected to the larger narrative and look at more closely how Joseph is kind of connected to this larger story of redemption. And this is, in fact, the idea that I asked you to kind of keep in the back of your head just a few minutes ago. This idea of Joseph being connected to this large patriarchal narrative. So you all know that Genesis is a book of beginnings. That's what the title means, beginning. In the beginning, God created everything. Then, as one of my professors in seminary said, he made the human race out of nothing and the Hebrew race into something. It's a nice, easy way to remember these eras. But Genesis isn't only a book about beginnings. It's actually a book about fulfillment as well. And if you read through it carefully, you'll see that there are promises in Genesis about blessing, and there are promises about fruitfulness, and there are promises about redemption, and all of these elements are present and contained in the Abrahamic promises of God. So in Genesis chapter 12, God makes the following promise to Abraham, 12, Verses 1 through 3, I'm only going to read a portion of it. And I will make of you a great nation, says God to Abraham, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So we see blessing and fruitfulness promised to Abraham by God here. Now, we often think that this verse is fulfilled in the New Testament through Christ, and that is absolutely true in the fullest sense of the promise. But I want you to think about just a couple of things. I will make you a great nation. God is already fulfilling that promise in Joseph. At this point in redemption history, Abraham and Sarah couldn't have children, and by the time the book of Genesis is done, 70 people went down with Jacob to Egypt. They have 70 descendants. Now that might not seem like very much, but from a couple of people who couldn't have babies, that's quite a bit. I will make your name great. Is this not exactly what has happened in this section of the Joseph story? Has God not made Joseph's name great, and thus Abraham's as well? He took a 17-year-old boy and turned him into the vizier of Egypt. Not only Egypt, or the savior of Egypt, not only Egypt, but of the entire region. And everyone in Egypt would have known the name of Joseph, even if it was by his Egyptian name. But it's the purpose statement that captures our attention, so that you will be a blessing, that is so clear in Joseph's story. All the earth came to Joseph to buy bread. God raised up and equipped Joseph through his experiences for this purpose. God's plan for Joseph's life was that he would be cast into the pit and that God would redeem him from the pit so that he could save many lives. So Joseph is also connected to the patriarchal history, not just through blessing and fruitfulness, but through redemption. In Genesis 15:3, God tells Abraham that his descendants will be enslaved for 400 years, and then he will redeem them. Joseph's slavery and his subsequent redemption both foreshadow and lay the groundwork for Israel's redemption from Egypt at the Exodus. All of this tells us that Joseph was redeemed for a purpose which foreshadows the greater redemption of the Exodus to come, which in itself foreshadows the greatest redemption of all that we have in Christ. So let me try to tie all this together with a couple of application points. First, if we're believers, we probably all have a pit and a past that God has redeemed us from, or that he is redeeming us from in different senses. We often forget in our stories of redemption, however, is that like Joseph, we are all part of a much, much bigger story. Our redemption does not occur in isolation, and our redemption is never brought about simply for our own sake. We're part of a much larger story of redemption that God has been working out since the fall, since eternity past when he made the covenant of redemption, but he's been working it out in history since the fall, and which Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 5 in the following way: all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Second, this story absolutely screams of God's providence, which according to the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 11, is his most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing all his creatures and all their actions. Think about the implications of that. Sometimes we get the wrong idea about God. Sometimes we get the wrong idea about God. The idea that we get is that God somehow peers down into human history and figures out what's happening and then responds. Oh, did they really just throw him in a pit? We should probably do something about that. Oh, really, Adam and Eve? What are we going to do about that? That is not how God works in his economy. God does not react to our actions in redemption. Instead, he doesn't watch the unfolding of human history and then react accordingly to keep things on track. Instead, God is proactive. And he's been proactive since eternity past. He does not assess history and respond. He has planned out every detail, and he carries it out according to what he purposed in eternity past for his glory. And my friends and dear ones, that is evident in the pages of Scripture, but especially in these pages about the story of Joseph. Redemption from the pit, redemption from our past, and redemption for a purpose. To God be the glory. Great things he has and will do.